Jesus is King. Welcome to another edition of Mass Confusion. I'm Timothy Flanders with 1 Peter 5. Today's topic is communion on the hand traditional. In my view, this is one of the most important topics out there today. And we have good news. This is a topic where all Catholics can agree. This is actually not a trad topic. In fact, in this presentation, we're going to be quoting from Paul VI to prove our point here. John Paul II, Benedict the 16th. And so this is a video that you can share with everybody. Take this, if you are a trad and you're watching this, take this video and give it to your priest. Give it to your friend who's not a trad. This is not a trad issue. This is a very, very Catholic issue, and it's not something that anybody we even need to disagree about. That's the good news. The bad news is it's the most probably the most ubiquitous problem in the liturgical crisis today, unfortunately. And we'll talk about what that is and all of this on today's episode. So let me pull up my PowerPoint, and we're going to talk about all this. Is communion in the hand traditional? So, as I said, this is an issue that all Catholics can agree about. And I want to first talk about the sources of all this information, because what we have here is, long story short, before you even get into those history, long story short, your priest, your bishop has been told something that is a lie. Period. They have been taught wrongly. And it's quite remarkable. And we're citing two bishops here, who wrote two different books. And we'll talk about this later, that Bishop Schneider actually convinced Pope Benedict of this very issue, and that's why Pope Benedict changed the way that he distributed Holy Communion. So we're going to talk about that and more. So first, this is one of the most essential texts on this topic. This is written by Bishop Juan Laise, now deceased. May he rest in peace. He's from Argentina. And he experienced where he was pressured by his brother bishops to impose communion in the hand. And he said, what is this? This was in the 90s. He said, what is this? And so he did research and he wrote this book, originally in Spanish. It's been brought into English by PCP Books. And so we appreciate what PCP Books has done. And then we also have Dominus Est. It's the other text here. This is by Bishop Schneider. And I believe this was his first book. He had an interview book. It may have come before this one by, I believe, a Czech interviewer. Sorry, apologies to the interview if I got that wrong, but some sort of Slav, I think. But this was one of the texts that sort of made Bishop Schneider famous before he's famous as he is now. And this was the text that he gave this text to Pope Benedict, and it convinced Pope Benedict to distribute communion only on the tongue. So we're going to talk about all that as well. He discusses that in this text. This is Bishop Schneider's other interview text with Diane Montagna, Christus, Vincit. So those are some of the sources that we're going to draw from in this little presentation. And I also want to mention that Mass of the Ages produced a different video 2 years ago with myself and Cameron O'Hearn, the director of Mass of the Ages. And that video is titled, What the Catholic Church Actually Says About Communion in the Hand, with Timothy Flanders. So that is, and in that video, we go through all the sources in much more detail than we're going to do right now. So you can also go to that video and get even more detail and more sources, and it's all linked below in the show notes in that video. So you've got everything you need to look everything and see all the evidence for this. As I said, this is not a controversial issue. It's remarkable that this is even controversial if you look at all these sources. Every single pope since Vatican II is on the side that I'm about to argue on. Okay? So this is very, very important. It's not a controversial issue. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. So let's talk about it, all the concepts, this whole thing. So first, as we always do in these presentations, we need to make a concession, because as with most of these myths about the liturgy, there is some truth contained somewhere in the myth. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so convincing. but usually the myth is far more complicated than people would have you to believe. So the first concession is that there did exist an ancient custom of communion in the hand in some places in the early church. We know this because there's various documents out there which mention placing the most blessed sacrament into the hands of the communicants. We know that this was the case in some places. And just a reminder, we will take questions at the end. So save your questions and we will get to those later as well. However, now, even though we know there was some form of communion in the hand in some places in the early church, there is an abyss that separates an ancient rite of communion in the hand versus the Protestant communion in the hand. So what we'll discuss in a minute is that there were certain forms of ancient communion in the hand in various places in the early church, but universally this practice was abandoned. The Protestants came along later, and they started with the assumption that the real presence did not exist. They started from a heretical assumption, and then they introduced a totally different practice. And their practice was the Lord's Supper. We've talked about this. We've talked about how their concept of the Lord's Supper was that the communion is just this supper. It's not a sacrifice, and it's certainly not a real presence. Martin Luther and John Calvin had various forms of the doctrine of real presence, but most Protestants, especially today, believe in the Zwinglian doctrine, which is that the Blessed Sacrament is just a symbol. And we know as Catholics that none of their communions are real anyways because they don't have real priesthood. Anyways, so they took this heretical beginning and they created a heretical practice based on their heretical belief. And the heretical practice was communion in the hand. Notice the differences. First, there are innumerable oral customs of reverence that are lost to history. This is perhaps the most important point about this, is that when you go into the history books and you look up something that was done somewhere, in a liturgical rite, you do not have all of the texts and rubrics about how exactly that was done. You have a mention by a father here and a father there, a saint there and a saint there, who say that there was a communion in the hand. You have no idea about all the different oral customs that were tied along with that. You have no idea, because this is not a missal with a bunch of rubrics about how exactly this is being done. So we have all these different oral customs that are totally lost to history. We don't really know exactly how these early Christians took communion in the hand. We do not know. We have guesses and ideas based on their writings. And one of the most important factors about this is that they adored the particles. They adored the particles. What do I mean by particles? I mean all the fragments of the bread. There are different customs, first of all, that sometimes in the early church there are leavened breads. There's leavened bread used in the Greek rite. There's unleavened bread used in the Armenian rite and in the Latin rite that we're familiar with. And these forms of bread get fragmented. There's pieces of bread that are tiny, very tiny. Some of them retain the appearance of bread, like a crumb, for example, in the case of leavened bread. Or a particle. A particle doesn't even look like bread. It's a little particle that it looks like a speck of dust. But we do know that the early church, if there was any form of communion in the hand, they adored and worshiped the particles as being the Lord. And so as a result, they received from the palm. What do I mean by that is that they received into their palm, the priest put it into their palm, and then they licked it up. And why do I know this? Because in the Greek rite, the priest and the deacon receive in the hand. They receive in the hand and they do this. They take it from their mouth, and that's how they receive it. Notice the difference here. If someone gives me a Dorito, puts it in my hand, I'm going to pick it up with my hand and put it in my mouth because it's ordinary food. That's how you eat a Dorito. But in the Greek rite, there is this communion in the hand for the deacon and the priest, and they take it from their hand because they adore the particles of the Lord. The Protestants have had no concept of this. They did not adore the particles of the Lord, and so they took it and they grabbed it like this because they don't adore. This is ordinary food for them. It's a symbol to them. That's a heretical practice. It's heretical if we're not adoring the particles of the Lord. And we'll talk about in just a minute all the different methods in which these particles are adored in just a minute. Obviously, maybe you're familiar with this practice where the priest puts his fingers together like this. That's because of the adoration of the particles. And so you note how this is completely different in the Protestantized version. It's utterly heretical because they don't believe in the real presence. They don't adore the particles. They don't have any customs that have to do with that. There's also the adoration, the act of adoration itself. So a related concept is receiving communion standing. But even if they are receiving communion standing, they are doing a bow. They're doing an act of adoration. There's also the incensing of washing of hands before and after. And we know this because the only ancient custom of communion in the hand that has been preserved is among the Syriac Christians of the East. And there are certain documents that were preserved from the 19th century and 20th century where there's all these other practices tied to this practice. So you notice this is totally different than the Protestant communion in the hand. So there's a huge abyss separating these two different customs because one is based on a heretical understanding of the Eucharist and the other is a Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. All sorts of different practices would follow if you believe in the Catholic dogma of the real presence. So that is one of the most important parts to understand about this. So what was introduced in the 1960s? It was the Protestant abuse of communion. That was what was introduced. They did this on the pretext of restoring an ancient custom, but what they were doing was they were imitating the Protestants as they were already doing it. This is because the ancient custom can never be restored. It's been lost to history. Based on all these other oral customs that we know existed, at least we know some of them. We don't know all of them. So we just don't know all the different oral customs that were going on at that time because not all of them were written down. So it's just something that you can't pluck out of history in an oral culture. You can't pluck that out of the history books and restore it. The best you could possibly do is you could create a new custom, but you would have to restore all sorts of different things to do. You might need to create new ways to venerate the particles in the modern period, in theory. But if we just look at this and we look at the bare fact that the particles are not adored, and I'll mention in just a minute that we've published a scientific study over at 1 Peter 5, and based on that we know that 15 to 20% of the time when communion in the hand is taken as it is today, particles of the Lord are scattered on the ground. And so this is a Protestant heretical practice of communion in the hand. That is what was introduced, not the ancient practice. Hence, Pope St. Paul VI condemned this and called it an abuse. This was introduced without any authorization in various Protestant majority countries after Vatican II, without permission. People just started doing it as a part of the revolutionary atmosphere of the 1960s. Paul VI called it an abuse. He then surveyed the world's bishops. The world's bishops opposed it as well. even though the bishops of the Netherlands produced a heretical catechism known as the Dutch Catechism, which challenged the belief in the real presence. But, and this is where Laise's book is very important, on May 2nd, 1972, the Holy Office, renamed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, confirmed that all fragments of the host, all fragments, must be treated the same way. Not only the fragments which retain the appearance of bread, i.e. they're bigger, so they still look like the host did before consecration, but also the other fragments, which are particles, little specks. And that is why, that is the reason for these practices. This is the most conspicuous one by the priest, because when he prays the Our Father, he sticks out his hands like this, and you can see that he has his hands stuck together like this, and that's because of the particles. When he touches the host, his hands can have particles on them, and that's the reason that he does this. He keeps on having his hands stuck together until he receives the ablution, where the altar boy pours the water and the wine on top of his fingers so that all of the particles can be consumed by him. And then there is also a white cloth that is used. If you've been an altar boy or a sacristan, you know there's an altar cloth that, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but there's a cloth that is folded by the priest and always put back into all of the materials for Holy Mass, because that cloth contains particles. So there's all these customs that are surrounding this dogma of the real presence, even in the particles. And that's the reason, this is why this is the key factor that separates an ancient practice that's obscure and difficult to define exactly what they did with the Protestant version. The Protestants do not venerate the particles. And I'm just going to reference two articles. Cat name says the corporal. Thank you. I don't have all my terms down. Thank you. So the corporal is what carries all those particles and prevents them from profanation. But this Protestant version of communion in the hand has no safeguard for preventing this profanation of the particles. So I want to reference two articles. You can go look up more information. Pope Paul VI promoted communion of the tongue. Also, priests, why do you allow Jesus to be literally trampled? That's the scientific study that we published that was done by a PhD and his wife. Now, here I'm going to quote Pope St. Paul VI. You know, Pope Francis canonized Paul VI, but Paul VI actually was totally opposed to communion in the hand. This is his document, Memoriale Domini. Here's what he says. He starts by saying, yes, there were certain places that had communion in the hand in the ancient church. But then he says this, quote, later, with a deepening understanding of the truth of the Eucharistic mystery, of its power, and of the presence of Christ in it, there came a greater feeling of reverence toward this sacrament, and a deeper humility was felt to be demanded when receiving it. Thus, the custom was established of the minister placing a particle of consecrated bread on the tongue of the communicant. So Paul VI himself, here's the Pope, everybody. He's the saint. Pope Francis canonized him. And what does he say? He says, communion in the hand was abandoned for the sake of more humility and more reverence. So Paul VI is confirming this development. This development is a good development, he says. And so he says, this method, i.e. receiving communion on the tongue, kneeling, must be retained, taking the present situation of the church and the entire world into account, not merely because it has many centuries of a tradition behind it, but especially because it expresses the faithful's reverence for the Eucharist. The practice, which must be considered traditional, ensures more effectively that Holy Communion is distributed with the proper respect, decorum, and dignity. Notice what the Pope is saying. He's saying that this one's better. This is better, says the Pope. He's not saying, oh, it's all the same. You can just receive on the tongue or receive in the hand. It's all the same. No, he's saying one is better than the other. This is why this doesn't need to be a controversial issue for anybody. So, what happened? If all this happened, why does everybody do this Protestant version of communion in the hand of the Novus Ordo? Well, Paul VI was manipulated by Bonini. We know that as a historical fact from various sources. This is documented in episode 2 of Mass of the Ages. And in 1975, Paul VI discovered that he was being manipulated by Bonini. That was when he initiated the Masonic investigation into the Curia. Paul VI discovered a lot of things about what was going on in the 70s, and he tried to rectify it. And one of these was the communion in the hand controversy. What he realized was that the machinations in the Vatican, all these bad actors, they were imposing and promoting communion in the hand with the world's bishops against his express permission, against his express intention. Now, Paul VI, to his shame, unfortunately, he still allowed, he confirmed these abuses that he said they were abuses, but then he gave his permission for these various countries. But when it first started, it was isolated. It was an isolated thing going on in Protestant countries. But it turned into a worldwide abuse, as it is today, because of the manipulations of what was going on in the Vatican. And Paul VI he began to really try to stop it by the later 70s. And this, as I said back, you can read Laise's book to get all the details. Paul VI tried to really stop this by the end of his pontificate. But at that point, the toothpaste was already out of the tube, as we say in the States. And it was very difficult to stop because this is all the zeitgeist of the Protestant mentality. The dominant Protestant mentality, especially in these Protestant countries, which is putting pressure on everybody, which is being manipulated by these bad actors in the Vatican. So, unfortunately, we do need to summarize it, but the history of this imposition of communion in the hand still needs to be written. It's a history that still needs to be written, exactly all these different machinations and the pulling of strings that happened until we got to the point where Laise, in the 1990s, Laise comes along and they say, you have to allow this. And he said, says who? Says who I have to allow it? And that's why Bishop Laise was such a strong bishop. Thank God for him. So now I want to fast forward to, we have to kind of skip over John Paul II, unfortunately, but I do want to mention St. John Paul II also, and you can go back to that longer video and get more quotes from St. John Paul II. But one of his greatest quotes on this is that there are no danger of excess in our reverence for the Blessed Sacrament. This is from one of his encyclicals. I think it's the last one, The Eucharistic Church. And so here we have Ratzinger giving John Paul II communion, obviously on the tongue. This was when John Paul II was really, his great holiness was the way he suffered and died, I think, one of his greatest shining virtues as Pope. But, as I said, we have, what happened here was that we have Pope Benedict, who chose to begin distributing communion on the tongue exclusively. Why did he do that? Well, the story is contained in this book, once again, Christus Vincit. This is the interview between Diane Montaigne and Bishop Schneider. And here is Christus Vincit, page 231. He says this: At the end of 2000, so this is Bishop Schneider explaining what happened to Diane Montaigne. He says, at the end of 2005, I wrote a letter to Benedict XVI and enclosed the manuscript of my book, Dominus Est. So real quick, this is, let me just mention. So once again, Dominus Est, it is the Lord. And this is, this was originally an article in L'Osservatore Romano. And, well, it was later published in L'Osservatore Romano. But this book, originally written by Schneider, about this issue. So, what happened? At the end of 2005, I wrote a letter to Pope Benedict XVI and enclosed the manuscript of my book, Dominus Est. In that letter, I implored the Pope in the name of Jesus Christ to stop distributing Holy Communion in the hand, but instead to give Holy Communion to the faithful kneeling and on the tongue. Pope Benedict answered me in a personally signed letter, in which he said that my arguments were convincing. Then, beginning with the Feast of Corpus Christi and until the end of his pontificate, Pope Benedict XVI distributed Holy Communion exclusively in this manner. The faithful knelt on a prie-dieu and received the body of Christ directly on the tongue. For me, this was a miracle, and I was filled with deep joy. I believe that my letter and the manuscript of my book, Dominus Est, did influence Pope Benedict XVI. So, like I said, this is not an issue between trads and non-trads. It's an issue where all Catholics, we can all agree that this whole practice is an abuse. This is an abuse, and it's a Protestant practice based on a heretical, it's an imitation of heretical Protestants. So, let's continue. We also have in 2007, Bishop Schneider in Kazakhstan, the Catholics of Kazakhstan, this is where Bishop Schneider is the bishop, they never introduced communion in the hand in Kazakhstan. But they had a problem that they had when there was travelers who would come into the country, they began to demand communion in the hand. And so Bishop Schneider and the other bishops of Kazakhstan wrote a protocol to impose communion on the tongue in their entire country so that no one was allowed to receive in the hand. This is in Christus Vincit 43. Conclusion. All Catholics can agree on this issue. This is not an issue that we need to divide on. In the longer video, we mentioned that really the first time that the Holy See has waffled on this, as I said, Paul VI confirmed it. John Paul II confirmed it. Benedict XVI confirmed it. The first time it became a question was under Pope Francis. And this only after Cardinal Sarah lost his office. So it was during the COVID crisis that this became an issue, and we talk about it in that video. So communion in the hand, as practiced today, is a Protestant abuse which has nothing to do with ancient practices. This practice is a direct assault on the precious dogma of the real presence. Every bishop must abolish this practice in their diocese, citing Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. So, once again, go to the sources that I mentioned, and you can please share this video with your priests, other Catholic friends, and this is something we can all unite on. And just a reminder to go to latinmass.com/give. Join the movement for the Mass of the Ages. This is not just the trilogy, it's so many other resources that we have planned for years to come. And it's spreading the Latin Mass, which is this Eucharistic reverence that we're trying to spread with this whole issue of communion in the hand. And 1peter5.com/crusade, that's our lay sodality. And one of the points that Bishop Schneider has asked for reparation is communion in the hand. So, very important. So, let's take your questions. Let me take a look at the questions. Antonia says, why did Paul VI permit it in the first place? Well, where is my, I don't know where I put that, but the latest biography of Paul VI is called The Divided Pope. The Divided Pope. I believe the Italians call him the Sad Pope, and Paul VI was a very complex figure. I don't think that it's true. Some trads think that he was a modernist or a Mason. That doesn't seem to be true, because he seems to be quite orthodox. He had this Orthodox Confession of Faith in 1968 before Humanae Vitae. As I said, he later sacks Bugnini. He initiates the Vatican investigations into Freemasonry. He tries to stop communion in the hand. So he does all these things to try to undo the damage and fight for the faith. He even says that modernism is still alive and well. The modernism that Pius X condemned in Pascendi is still alive and well. So he's even condemning modernism. So he doesn't seem to be unorthodox. He does seem to be weak. Weak and easily manipulated. And to be fair, that was an issue under Pius XI, who condemned the Cristeros, or condemned Padre Pio, for example. He was manipulated. So even a good pope can be manipulated. Paul VI also had, these vast dreams of this great revival that he was going to impose by having the new mass and all this stuff. So it seems that he acceded, even though he believed it was an abuse, he acceded to these requests of the bishops who were pressuring him to do it. He let them do it. He said, no, this is wrong. I don't want it, but I'm going to let you do it because you are pressuring me. So in that sense, I mean, it's just a very sad moment. Perhaps the saddest moment is that he's betraying the doctrine of the real presence. And the problem with the pontificate since then is that there's been a reluctance. Been a reluctance to use the papal or episcopal discipline to discipline and force bad bishops or priests, force them to stop the abuses. Even Benedict XVI, who was convinced, even he himself did not impose it. He's all he did was he set an example, and we're grateful for that example. But they did not feel that they could impose it. And this part of this is because of the people were tired of an environment that happened in the 40s and 50s, an environment they felt was too restrictive. And to agree, it was in some ways, but that can be disputed. So it's complicated. But as I said, the history has not totally yet been written of all the different machinations as to how this got all going, even though it was officially, prohibited or officially discouraged. All right. So let me take a look. Sharon says, the Eucharistic revival is dependent upon kneeling for the Lord and receiving him from consecrated hands. Yes, the bishops of the United States are seeking a Eucharistic revival. Mass of the Ages and 1 Peter 5 will be at the Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis in July. And we're grateful that the bishops have targeted this issue. This is the source and summit of our faith, as Vatican II says. But that's why we hope that more bishops will become informed by this, like Bishop Laise was. Bishop Laise was not informed. He just continued to do the communion on the tongue as he was taught, and then he had to do his own research and dig into the history to try to figure out what went wrong, what was happening, why do they think he should do this. And so it's unfortunate that many bishops are just not aware of all these things. So once again, share this video, share it with your priest, share it with your bishop, share it with fellow Catholics. All of the, again, this is not a trad issue. This is all Catholics can agree on this. So, Antonia says, but who introduced this abuse? Basically, the abuse began in these Protestant majority countries like Belgium, Netherlands. Unfortunately, to my shame, that's Flanders. That's where Flanders is in Belgium. But they introduced the abuse, and then it was introduced through these machinations where these different people in Vatican were trying to pressure people into doing it. It was not even allowed in the United States until the early 70s, but they started to do the abuse. So, let me take a look at any other questions. Oh, Antonia says, I'm from Flanders. Well, it's a great thing to be for. Here's the flag of Flanders right here behind me, behind my right shoulders. Flanders has a great tradition, especially the Army of Flanders against the Dutch heretics. But the Flemish have not always been perfect Catholics, of course. I think this is the great question to end on here. What is best done if a parish priest denies communion in the tongue? What is the best way to gradually change this? Well, so this brings up the current issue, and the current issue is that what happened is that the Holy See has continually defended the right of the faithful to receive communion in the tongue. There's various documents that have been put out that, again, go back to that longer video where we have all these other sources. Until Pope Francis, Cardinal Sarah, when he was under Pope Francis, he also confirmed the right of the faithful to receive on the tongue. But then there was a controversy that arose during the COVID crisis where I believe it was Bishop Sticca, could be wrong. But there was a bishop who was trying to impose communion in the hand for the sake of the coronavirus, and the faithful were fighting with him, so he appealed to Rome, and then the new guy in Rome gave an ambiguous answer and did not defend the right of the faithful to receive on the tongue. And so now the faithful do not have that, don't have the way to defend themselves against this abuse if they are imposed on that. So I think that it's difficult. It's very difficult if you have a priest who's willing to go that far, who's willing to refuse you. I mean, I think a great spiritual work of mercy would be to talk to that priest, to ask for a meeting one-on-one, and say, Father, I'm really confused, and try to be, very not adversarial about it. Don't be adversarial with this priest. You're trying to win over this priest's heart he's been taught otherwise. If this priest is of bad will, don't even bother. If you have a priest who's, you can tell he's just doesn't love his flock, he doesn't care about anybody, that type of priest, just ignore it. Leave that parish, go to some other parish. I mean, it's hard to change a priest's heart like that. But a lot of these priests, I think, they just are just not even aware of these things. If they're, they were just taught wrong in their seminary and whatnot. They didn't read Bishop Laise in the seminary, and so you just need to entreat him as a father. He's your father. Entreat him as a father. Respect his authority. Talk to him as you would your own father, and appeal to him and appeal to his fatherly heart. That's the only way we can get priests on board. And then, you can share this video with other parishioners, talk to other parishioners. This is something that can only change when people join in with the same spirit of this Eucharistic crusade of reparation, where we have a mass movement where the laity are demanding Eucharistic reverence, they're demanding communion on the tongue. We live in a period of clericalism where even laity think that the church is the clerics, but the church is the baptized. That's what the church is. And so when clergy face a bunch of laity who are all demanding this in the most respectful way possible, not in an adversarial way, the priest will accede to your request. So that's my advice. do your best to try to appeal to him and pray really hard to the Theotokos, to Our Lady. So that's all we have. Again, share this video, share it with your priest, your bishop. This information needs to get out, especially in a year of Eucharistic revival. This is the moment where we can really share this and how important it is. So that is all we have. So thanks a lot for watching. Again, go to 1peter5.com/crusade. Join the crusade. God bless.
The Mass of the Ages donors are bringing traditional Catholicism to millions. Go to latinmass.com/give to join the movement.